All right, class, good day. This is actually the third time I'm recording this lesson. That's because I shut my mic off halfway through one of our videos. So what we're going to be talking about today are three documents from England that greatly influenced the United States today. And these would have been the first constitutions. You may have heard that word. There's a couple different definitions of constitution. So for the purposes of this class, we're going to define it as a body of fundamental principles or established precedents according to which a state or other organization is acknowledged to be governed. This is really important. So what we're going to go over today is essentially what the American colonists and subsequent Americans thought that the British government should have been governed by. And this is going to be really important because it's going to establish a precedent or a standard for us in our country. The idea that following the rule of law and people need to subscribe to what standards the people have given to them, especially at the government level. A constitution is also the mode in which a state or society is organized, especially the manner in which sovereign power is distributed. So this is, you're going to hear a term me mention a constitution as a blueprint. This kind of lays out the pipes and the woodworks of how government is supposed to be functioning. And I want you to, as we're going through these documents, pay close attention to a couple things. One would be the idea of where is the government, be it the king or parliament in this case, and I'll explain what parliament is, but where is the English government throughout this 400-year history abusing its power? Pay close attention to that. And two, how does each of these documents essentially limit that power, and what precedent, think about how this amplifies the need for a limited government. All right. So we're going to talk about the Magna Carta, which is our first one, the Petition of Rights, and the English Bill of Rights. I have a video here about the Magna Carta, so let's start off and play this.
This may look like a plain, unassuming piece of parchment, but is actually one of the most famous documents in the world. Magna Carta, meaning the Great Charter, has inspired people across the centuries, from Thomas Jefferson to Mahatma Gandhi. But why was the Charter originally created, and what does it actually say? Let us take you back to medieval England. It's the year 1215, and the ruler is King John. Many people believe that King John was one of the worst kings in history. He imprisoned his former wife, he starved his opponents to death, he allegedly murdered his own nephew, and pulled the beards of the Irish chiefs. King John had imposed heavy taxes on his barons in order to pay for his expensive foreign wars. If they refused to pay, he punished them severely or seized their property. The barons demanded that King John obey the law. When he refused, they captured London and John was forced to negotiate. The two sides met at Runnymede in June 1215. The result of the negotiations was written down by the king's clerks into the document we know as Magna Carta. Although most of the Charter's clauses dealt with medieval rights and customs, Magna Carta has become a powerful symbol of liberty around the world. The most famous clause, which is still part of the law today, for the first time gave all free men the right to justice and a fair trial. No man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by the judgment of their equals and by the law of the land. To no one will we sell. However, this clause was not as liberal as it sounds. The Charter only applied to free men. The vast majority of people in 1215 were unfree peasants who were ruled over by their landowners. And although Magna Carta was intended to create peace between King John and his rebellious barons, England was plunged into civil war after the Pope declared the Charter invalid. When King John died of dysentery in 1216, 9-year-old Henry III took to the throne. To keep the peace, Magna Carta was reissued several times during the 13th century, until it was finally made part of English law. Magna Carta has lived on for 800 years and is echoed in the United States Declaration of Independence and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Perhaps Magna Carta's most important legacy is that everyone, including our leaders, must obey the law. What started out as a document of specific complaints from a group of barons has turned into an international symbol of liberty, without which we might not have the rights we value so much today.
All right. So just a couple of reviews on the Magna Carta. It was also basically just means the Great Charter was signed by King John in 1215. He actually did not sign it. He actually could not read, so he stamped it, which was essentially the same thing as e-signing today. But he was forced to sign it by a group of nobles, which was really the start of Parliament. Now, Parliament is essentially England's equivalent of Congress. It's its legislative body made up of representatives. They were primarily upset about the tax system. You know, King John, you saw, was using it to fund his lavish lifestyle, but they thought it was a little bit more important to be funding the Navy. Wrong time period. They were a little upset that he was using it to fund his lavish lifestyle at the expense of them, and then if they didn't obey, they had their property taken away. So there's that. They were in prison without a trial, so it establishes a couple of those key rights. It's important to note that these were only certain rights to the nobility, so it wasn't, the video said, as liberal, which really comes from the root word liberty, as it sounds, essentially. But it was the first time that government is limited in writing, and it really shows that dictator is really only as powerful as the people around them. You could also see some tension here in terms of where does government originate from. You know, you might want to go back to our thinking about the origins of a state. Why might the Pope have ripped up the Magna Carta? And why might the king or the monarchy have agreed with the Pope in that circumstance? So you can see there's an issue of, does government come from the people, or does it come from, you know, this divine right of kings? Fast forward about 400 years later, and this is where the Playboy party lifestyle comes into play with King Charles. So I apologize for that little error. King Charles, at this point, is asking Parliament for more money, more so to fund his lavish lifestyle. At the time, Parliament is just a little bit more than a financial advisory board. They want a little bit more power. They're upset with the way the king is spending his money. They think that he should be really focusing on building the navy, because at this time Spain has a really powerful navy and is actually raiding parts of the English and Irish coast. At this time, Ireland was part of the Kingdom of England, and Parliament wanted a little bit more power. They threatened civil war in 1628, but King Charles ended up signing the Petition of Right. Unfortunately, this would not be the last time there would be conflict. So the Petition of Right included the idea of, again, trial by jury for everyone, not just for the nobility. It was illegal to impose martial law, so it was illegal to use the military to essentially enforce the law. I want you to think about that based on what you know possibly about the American Revolution. If you don't know, write that down in your notes and we can address that a little bit later. There was also a protection of privacy. The king's army was not to be sheltered in private homes. Fast forward 150 years later, during the American Revolution, where were the king's soldiers housed? It was new territory. It's not like they had outposts here. They had to be housed in homes. So there's an issue of privacy that we still value here, and some of it comes from this Petition of Right. The key thing here was that Parliament would hold the exclusive right to tax. So the king couldn't tax. Parliament would gain a little bit more power, and that the English citizens could not be taxed without having a representative in Parliament. There was this phrase, no taxation without representation. Unfortunately, the rule of law was not held and would lead to the English Civil War. Parliament was disbanded by the king in 1640, And 9 years later, through a bloody civil war, he would be beheaded in 1649. And again, it just really does highlight questions of authority in American English thought. Who holds power? Is it the king, or is it the will of the people? And this would be played out really on our side of the country as well, because many of the Puritans were actually more in favor of the king because they held the idea of the divine right of kings. Yet at the same time, they were also trying to establish their own government. So a little bit of irony there. Um, the English Civil War would end in 1660 with the reign of King Charles II. He would take the throne again. Parliament would be fairly disorganized. King Charles II came back primarily as a Catholic king. Now, this is important because at the time, religious identity was very much connected to national identity. If you remember last year from world history, or the primarily Catholic countries in Europe were France and Spain and Italy and the Holy Roman Empire. So to be Catholic during this time is to align yourself with the enemies of England. And naturally, the people of England don't like that. Primarily Protestant in nature, they want a Protestant king. So Parliament sets up, once they get organized, has William of Orange come over from Holland. Holland would have been a Protestant nation, and he is established as the King of England in 1688. However, he is reduced to a puppet head, which more or less means that he doesn't really have any power, and there's people over him that have power. And it's the first time, really in all of modern history at least, that a legislative body or the will of the people dominates over a dictatorship, and they are the source power, not a divine right of king. The king would retain some control of the military. That's why it matters in the American Revolution and in foreign affairs, but essentially had no power, no law power, and no power to tax. They also forced King William of Orange to sign the English Bill of Rights. So they had a Bill of Rights too. So I also want you to see that these ideas are not, our idea for a Bill of Rights. It's not coming out of thin air. They're coming out of history and people's experience. We have the similar idea with history, right? We get ideas from people around us, and the American colonists were no different. But they said that the king could not tax any money without the permission of Parliament, could not hold a standing army in peacetime. Key point there. There was protection from cruel and unusual punishment. There was the right to petition the government, to ask the government to change things. We actually can do that today, sometimes with more success and less success, depending on the time. And there are also solidified criminal rights that you can see here. So in conclusion, the English Bill of Rights, Magna Carta, Petition Right, all gave Englishmen certain rights. Each milestone was accomplished because the government, particularly the monarchy, acted strongly and aggressively, and the American colonists would assume that they had these rights and expected the British Parliament to uphold them. If you need to add some things, there is a note-taking guide here as well. It should give you an idea of where you need to fill in. So if you already have your notes, great, but if you don't, check this and make sure you have everything you need.